Have you ever seen this creepy bird-like mask? It's the iconic symbol of the plague doctor, a figure that haunts our collective memory of one of the darkest times in human history, the Black Death. But what's the real story behind this terrifying mask? Was it actually worn during the Black Death of the 14th century? The answer might surprise you. Stick around as we unmask the myths and reveal the true history of the plague doctor. First, let's set the scene. Imagine Europe in the mid-1300s. A terrifying, unstoppable disease is sweeping across the continent. They called it the Great Pestilence, or later, the Black Death. It was the bubonic plague caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, and it wiped out an estimated 30 to 50% of Europe's population. People were desperate. They had no idea what caused the plague or how it spread. Was it a punishment from God? Was it bad air or miasma? Or was it something else entirely? In the midst of this chaos, a new kind of physician emerged, the plague doctor. These weren't your typical, highly trained university doctors. Many were second-rate physicians, young doctors trying to make a name for themselves, or even people with no medical training at all who saw an opportunity. They were hired by cities and towns to treat everyone, rich and poor alike, which was a pretty novel concept back then. Their job was grim. They documented deaths, performed autopsies to try and understand the disease, and offered what little comfort or cures they could. These so-called cures were often bizarre and ineffective, ranging from bloodletting and lancing buboes, those painful, swollen lymph nodes, to applying mixtures of frog paste and onion. It was a desperate time, calling for desperate measures. Now, let's get to the most famous part of their attire, that iconic beak mask. Here it is, the big reveal. This mask was not used during the medieval Black Death in the 14th century. The classic plague doctor costume we all recognize actually originated much, much later, during a plague outbreak in the 17th century. So, where did the design come from? We can trace it back to a French physician named Charles Delorme who served several French kings, including Louis XIII. Around 1619, he developed a full-body protective suit for doctors treating plague patients. He believed the disease was spread through miasma, or bad-smelling corrupt air. His invention was designed to be a kind of personal protective equipment, an early modern hazmat suit, to shield the doctor from this poisonous air. Let's break down the full uniform. It started with a long waxed leather overcoat that went from neck to ankle. Underneath, they wore leggings, gloves, boots, and a hat, all made of waxed leather. The idea was that the smooth, waxy surface would prevent the miasma from sticking to the doctor's clothes. It also probably helped repel fleas, which we now know were the real carriers of the plague bacteria, though they didn't know it at the time. And now, the centerpiece, the mask. It was designed to cover the entire head and featured glass eyepieces to protect the eyes. The most striking feature, of course, was the long, hollow beak, about 6 inches long. This wasn't just for show. The beak was filled with a potent mix of aromatic herbs, spices, and other substances. We're talking about things like mint, cloves, camphor, myrrh, rose petals, and laudanum. This collection of scents was called a theriac. The theory was that these strong, pleasant smells would filter out the deadly miasma, purifying the air the doctor breathed before it entered his lungs. In essence, the beak was an early form of a respirator, based on a flawed but logical for the time theory of disease. To complete the look, plague doctors often carried a long wooden cane. This tool had a very practical purpose. It allowed them to examine patients, push them away, or even direct family members on how to move the sick or the dead without ever having to make direct physical contact. So, while Charles Delorme designed this suit with scientific, or what passed for scientific, principles in mind, you can imagine how terrifying it must have looked to the average person. Imagine being sick, feverish, and in pain, and then this strange bird-like figure walks into your room. It's no wonder the plague doctor became a symbol of death and impending doom. Their arrival often meant that death was near, not just for the patient, but potentially for the whole household. The image of the plague doctor in his beaked mask was popularized through engravings and became a stock character in Italian street theater, known as commedia dell'arte. This helped cement the image in the public consciousness, forever linking the beak mask with the plague, even though its use was limited to the 17th century and beyond, not the massive pandemic of the Middle Ages. So what did medieval doctors in the 14th century wear? The truth is, there was no standard uniform. They wore their normal clothes, maybe with some simple additions like covering their faces with a cloth. They relied on more superstitious methods, like holding a pomander, a small ball of perfumed substances, to their nose to ward off the miasma. It was a far cry from the elaborate costume that would come 250 years later. The history of the plague doctor's mask is a fascinating story of how medicine, fear, and culture intersect. It shows us how people tried to make sense of a world turned upside down by a disease they couldn't understand. The mask wasn't a product of medieval superstition, but rather a creation of the early modern scientific mind, an attempt to combat disease based on the best theory they had at the time, the miasma theory. While the theory was wrong, the principle behind it, creating a barrier between the doctor and the disease, was a step in the right direction. It was one of the earliest attempts at personal protective equipment, a concept we are all very familiar with today. The plague doctor's mask remains a powerful symbol. It represents a dark chapter in history, but also the enduring human spirit of trying to fight back against disease, even with limited knowledge. It's a reminder of how far medicine has come, and the debt we owe to those who faced pandemics in the past. So, the next time you see that creepy bird mask at Halloween or in a movie, you'll know the real story. It's not from the medieval Black Death, but from a later era, a fascinating piece of medical history born from a flawed but earnest attempt to save lives. Thanks so much for watching and for diving into this piece of history with me. If you found this interesting, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you don't miss our next historical deep dive. What other historical myths would you like us to uncover? Let me know in the comments below. See you next time.